Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT patch rundown video. Today I'll be breaking down the final patch of set 6, 12.10. That's right folks, this is it. We're at the end of set 6 as a whole and 12.10 is the last patch. Unfortunately, as with all final sets of the patch, this one is going to be both small in changes and a bit underwhelming. There's a few reasons, but the most obvious one is of course the release of set 7 on the PBE. Don't worry though if your goal is to continue to play set 6 to climb ranked. There's still plenty of people playing on the live servers, and we're here to help by reviewing the 12.10 patch to assist you with your rank climb. That said, don't expect too many changes because there's overall not many adjustments. Alright, let's get started. There are no system or augment changes in this patch, so we're diving right into the trait changes. Even though quite a few AP champions did well in 12.9, there weren't many top of the meta AP compositions. To address that issue, Arcanists are receiving some decent vertical buffs. By vertical, we mean the 6 and 8 tier for Arcanists is going up to 100-150 total AP from 90-135. These buffs won't help much for the mid game where it's unlikely a board will be running 6 or more Arcanists, but it definitely helps their scaling. Victor still does a ton of work in the late game, so even more scaling with an Arcanist composition just means he'll melt boards even faster. But that's about where the buff stops, since the only composition that will see anything from this change is vertical Arcanists. Still a much needed buff nonetheless. Hextech still managed to be put by the wayside last patch, as Sivir still heavily favored Striker as the go-to synergy to build a composition around. One of the main issues for Hextech is the bonus magic damage got heavily reduced by anyone running enchanters. Plus, Strikers just scaled better. In 12.10, they circumvented this issue by instead increasing the shields for Hextech. The shields will now be 100, 175, 300, 425, up from 100, 150, 275, 375. A relatively sizable increase at the higher tiers, meaning we may see some vertical Hextech buffs. Keep in mind, with the egg dropping a free tome, it's definitely doable to play any trait vertically. More than likely, the meta won't change a whole lot from this, other than seeing more mid-game Hextech boards with Lucian carry. Sivir still scales better with Strikers, but as far as the mid-game goes, there may be a few more options, at least for Hextech. Another synergy receiving vertical buffs is Twin Shot. Twin Shot has been in a weird spot for a few patches. Mainly what the problem falls under is a reliance on good augments. Things like Sharpshooter or having Twin Shot Soul become a necessity, otherwise the synergy lacks scaling. It also doesn't help that AP damage became less viable in 12.9 thanks to the Enchanter buffs. Hopefully buffing both the chance for an additional cast or attack alongside more attack damage at the higher tiers of Twin Shot will bring it back into relevancy. Or at least back to being a more standard composition as opposed to only being playable when specific augments were available. That said, if these buffs don't help with consistency, at least high roll Twin Shot boards the late game Jinx carry will be even stronger than before. The time is finally here for any Yordle enthusiasts to finally get out here and spam 6 Yordle boards because they're increasing the mana reduction from 33% to 40%. That's a sizable change, but is it enough? One of the main issues Yordles suffer from is a lack of a good late game carry. Corki may be better after this change, but he's still mainly AP damage, so enemy players can just toss in enchanters to counter him. Gnar has a chance of shining by throwing more rocks, but ultimately 6 Yordles is often not worth it unless you have the so small augment. Then it's definitely playable, albeit still lackluster. At the end of the day, it's an overall good buff since 6 Yordles is so rarely played nowadays, but it's unlikely to matter too much for the upper end of the meta. They're going the other direction with vertical buffs by nerfing 8 bodyguards. Honestly, this isn't too surprising because 8 bodyguards can be ridiculously difficult to play against. We even saw how effective that composition was in the Set 6 Worlds tournament, and that was before the free tome. Overall, it's not like nerfing 8 bodyguards drastically does anything to the meta, but at least in the rare instances where you play against it, there's a chance to win. Try as they might, Colossus is still a bit of a joke synergy. Sure, the units are decent, but come on, 4 to 6 slots for not that amazing of a trait is a bit much. Even enticing players by buffing the bonus health of 3 Colossus is unlikely to make a difference. That said, there's a world where 3 Colossus becomes a playable composition, at least on the outskirts of the meta. Get an augment like Armor Plating or Titanic Force, and there's a chance it will do well. Unlikely, but still a chance. One of the more interesting changes in 12.9 was the addition of the 5 trait bonus for Enforcers. It hasn't proven itself to be all that viable, so naturally, they're buffing the bonus attack speed from 80% to 100%. This doesn't necessarily mean Enforcers will start doing well, but it does open interesting paths with an Enforcer emblem. 100% bonus attack speed is a lot, especially on champions like Draven, Jinx, or Sivir. Much like Colossus, it's entirely possible we'll see fringe boards pop up using 5 Enforcers when certain conditions are met. Obviously, an emblem is needed, but also the augment True Justice can help turn the tide. If the stars align, it could make for some very interesting endgame boards. In general, this won't matter much for the meta since 5 Enforcer is not exactly feasible in most games. Buffs of 4 Scholar wasn't enough, they're also buffing 6. Mana gain from 6 Scholars is going up to 30 from 25. That's a lot of mana, but let's consider it practically. How often do we see 6 Scholar compositions? Rarely, if ever. Will buffing 6 Scholars change that? Probably not, but at least it's possible to play a 6 Scholar board. Once again, it's augments that swoop in to help, as lifelong learning is the best avenue for playing a 6 Scholar composition. With early game scaling on Syndra or Zyra, it's possible to use them as mid-game carries or even re-roll them. Then late game Renata becomes relevant again since she'll be casting more often, and Silco is, well, Silco. Point is, there's merit to a 6 Scholar composition, but it relies a lot on specific scenarios playing out, much like the aforementioned Colossus and Enforcer changes. Finally, to end the trait changes, we have several nerfs to Innovator. We all saw these nerfs coming from a mile away because Innovator was just too ubiquitous in the meta. Practically any endgame composition could be played with 3, 5, or even 7 Innovators and still do well. Every auto attack carry besides Sivir had the option of being played with Innovator. For us, we'd rather leave Innovators alone for this final patch because the synergy does promote flex play, but we do understand that to get players utilizing other traits is a necessary adjustment. So what are the nerfs? Across the board for each summon, the main nerf is lower health. Scarab got hit by the smallest nerf while the Dragon got smacked by the largest. This basically means the late game vertical Innovators will be less viable overall, while using the synergy as a flex should remain viable. They're also doubling on the bear nerfs as the magic and armor resistance of the bear is going down to 50 from 55. Once again, this mainly targets boards focused heavily on the Innovator synergy. What all this boils down to is this: 3 Innovators should remain a perfectly stable synergy to build a flex board around, while 5 and 7 Innovators will be less consistent. Still playable, but it should lead to fewer games where the Innovator emblem is an auto pick from the tome, and instead other synergies become more appealing. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll see less Innovators, but more like we'll see other synergies more often. Let's now move on to the champion changes. There aren't many here, as no 1 or 2 cost units were adjusted this patch, with the main focus being on 4 cost champions. Since most of the low cost units are out of the picture, let's dive right in, as the only 3 cost unit being changed is Echo. Echo nerfs may seem harsh when taking into account the Innovator nerfs, but don't fret, they've only targeted 1-star Echo. This mostly affects the early game, where having an Echo practically puts you on a win streak, since hitting Echo 2 in the mid game is not all that difficult or uncommon. The nerfs are slightly less damage to his ability, along with slightly less bonus attack speed. Nothing crazy, and certainly not enough to remove Echo from the meta. Just something to keep in mind in the early game is that Echo 1 is the tiniest bit weaker. As you said, 4 cost champions are the target of this patch, with quite a few of the nerfs being handed out. Draven is receiving a small nerf, as you guessed it, he's losing 5 attack damage, which puts him at a baseline of 85 from 90. The question here is, why? Sure, Draven is doing well, but historically throughout the mid-set, Draven has been on the weak side or practically unplayed. Yes, 5 less attack damage isn't that big of a deal, but still, leave poor Draven alone. Let him have his time in the sun. On a slightly more serious note, the 5 attack damage nerfs and buffs that have basically become a meme at this point are still interesting to talk about. Question being, do they matter? In some cases, yes, it actually has had an impact on the performance of the champion. For Draven specifically, we've seen that the 5 extra damage didn't matter at all for him, but 15 that they did in 12.9 definitely made a difference. Point is, we'd prefer to see more drastic buffs like they did for Draven than tweak it slowly, as it's more likely to find the sweet spot of the balance. We all expected this, but Orianna is on the chopping block for nerfs. She had to be because Orianna was easily the strongest champion in the game for all of 12.9. Certainly the most played and contested at the very least. They've reduced her damage at tier 1 and 2 while only nerfing the shields for her ability at tier 1. Additionally, her max mana went up by 10. Damage and shields are a bit whatever, though it does help bring Orianna in line with the other 4-cost utility champions. The real change to note is the increase in mana, because that was one of the main reasons she became so good in 12.9. An increase of 10 is certainly not as impactful as a decrease of 50 that she received before, but it still should make a difference. The initial mana for the first cast remains the same, but slowing down how often she casts after that should help tone down Orianna's impact in a fight. That said, she's still going to be really strong, so don't expect to see her used less in 12.10. After gutting Morellonomicon, they didn't end up giving any compensation to poor Renata. Luckily, they are now. It's not much, just a 10 damage buff at level 1 and a 5 damage buff at level 2 for her ability, but hey, a buff is a buff, and Renata definitely needed them. This may be enough for Renata to return to the meta, which will then result in fewer AD boards and overall a better mix between AP and AD. But with Morellonomicon being still pretty weak, it also may mean Renata still is relatively unplayed. Only time will tell. A fairly minor adjustment is buffs to Ahri's ability damage. Nothing significant, but it should help her be a bit more consistent in the mid-game. Plus, keep in mind the Vertical Arcanist buff may come into play and Ari returns to being a consistent AP champion, at least until everyone plays 5 enchanters to counter her. Another small change is to Aurelia, as her ability scaling is going up by 5%. It's almost not worth mentioning other than the fact that it's a buff to a striker champion, and strikers aren't exactly in need of any buffs. Odd, but again, almost too small to mention. The final change of the patch is to Victor. At first glance, it looks like crazy buffs for Victor until you realize, oh, it's just damage his ability does against shields. That's still a good thing since enchanters have a lot of shields and are a natural counter to Victor, so making him better against shields makes sense. This will definitely matter in the meta, but not quite as meaningful as, say, if they buffed his baseline ability damage by similar numbers. That's all for today, folks. We wish everyone good luck on their final 2 weeks of climbing ranked for Set 6. Our journey doesn't end yet for Set 6, as we'll be taking a look back on the different aspects of the meta, including top champions and compositions. We'll also have a few Set 7 preview videos, so stay tuned for those. Let us know in the comment section below what your plans are for the final patch of Set 6. Remember to check out GiantSlayerTV social media channels in the description below to keep up to date with any news, shows, or other content. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.